So I'm going to pose a legitimate question for you. Let's say for the sake of discussion, one is thinking EV. Does one need all-wheel drive? And here's why I ask. Tesla, Ford, Kia, Hyundai, Porsche, pretty much everybody that's trying to be anybody in the EV world, whether it's a crossover or a car, it's on offer as rear-wheel drive or all-wheel drive, or in some cases, front-wheel drive or all-wheel drive. I think today, at least in one use case, we should answer that question. Okay, considering what we just discussed, here's an obvious question. What's the difference between this EQS we're about to drive and the two we have already driven? You will not be surprised to learn that this one is two-wheel drive. In the EQS world, that means rear-wheel drive. That is where the electric motor is mounted. Now let's discuss that motor because it's a different output, obviously, than the 580 we've already driven. That 580, you may remember, was 516 horsepower. This one is 245 kilowatts, which translates to 329 horsepower and 417 pound-feet of torque. Now let's put that aside and talk about the battery, which really isn't different than the 580 we've already driven, the all-wheel drive model. It's 107.8 kilowatt hour, broken up into 216 cells. Now, something that still surprises me after driving 3 of these things, the first ever Mercedes-Benz S-Class that has an electric propulsion system does not have a charging architecture that is comparable to a Porsche and a Hyundai. So what am I trying to say here? It does not have an 800-volt architecture. I'm going to jump ahead to the wish list here. Please, oh please, oh please, change that. And now, why do I bring it up? Well, it does impact charging times. So this is a good-sized battery. The EPA rates this thing for 350 miles in the EQS 450 Plus, 340 in the 580 with the all-wheel drive. So charging it, let's say I do it here in the hangar on a 240 charger, 11 and a half hours to get from 10 to 100%. But if I find one of those like level 3 DC fast chargers out in the wild, that going from 10 to 80% is 31 minutes. Now, performance figures, that's a bit of a better prospect. So 0 to 60 on this, not the fastest thing out there, 5.9 seconds. If you remember the AMG, that's the last EQS we drove, that was 3.4 seconds to 60. VMAX, you will not be surprised to learn, is electronically limited to 130 miles an hour. If you remember, the VMAX on the AMG was 155 miles an hour. One would expect it to be heavy, and one would not be disappointed, 5,597 pounds, or depending on express weights and measures, 2,538 kilograms. Put another way, that is 91 pounds lighter than a 580. Sport mode. And here we go. It's not slow. It's definitely not slow. It definitely does not have the immediacy of the EQS AMG. Is there a huge difference in acceleration in the 580? I'm going to say there's a sizable, but not huge. And it all has to do with the lack of the front motor in this case. And I gotta be honest with you, I really expected that front motor and the drive shafts to the front wheels to weigh more than 91 pounds. You know what, let me put this to you in a bit of a different light, and that would be on a spectrum. And not this is slow and this is fast, where a Taycan Turbo S will be up here. It's more, this is a luxury car, and then this up here would be something more of a sports sedan, full-fat AMG. This, with only the rear motor and only what we said, 329 horsepower, it's not a slouch. It's not a slow car. It just reinforces that it's a luxury car first, then an electric car. Yes, it is indeed that time again to play your favorite game on the Options Game with today's contestant, an EQS that has 2 less drive wheels, otherwise known as the EQS 450 Plus, for a base price of $102,310. Then we press on to an area we must celebrate. We don't have to pay extra for the paint. That's because it's black, and I would go so far as to saying black is one of the better colors on this design. And this specific car here, serial ending 34, the Niva gray interior, which is leather, fantastic contrast. And something that helps it is the sage brown top of the dash. The tactile feel, it's not just the color, it's the tactile feel of like this nubuck on the top of the dash and door panels. Transforms both the color and the tactile feel of the car. Now we do have to pay extra for the wood, which we've seen in other S-Class as well as EQS. It's the brown walnut that has the aluminum lines, kind of like this yacht look. $1,550, I'd say money well spent. Then believe it or not, we have to pay extra for a 110-volt charger. In this case, it's a 9.6 kilowatt charger, $250. Then, because it's 2022 and we are living in crazy times, we get $50 back because there aren't enough chips for the valet mode. Then we go on to the HEPA filter because after all it is 2022, $450. Then the dash cam, again 2022, but maybe not Los Angeles, more Moscow, $200. Then the front massage multi-contour seats, $1,100. Then the laminated safety glass, $1,010. The active ambient lighting, why is this optional in a $102,000 car? $590. And then also falling under the heading of why is this optional in a $102,000 car? Rapid heated front seats, $450. Then something that is completely against my religion, should be against all religions, toll payment system, $200. So I'm giving Mercedes $200 so I can give the government more money to not fix the roads. Anyway, I'll get off my soapbox there. And then there's the Hyperscreen. Remember, this is fitted as standard to the 580 all-wheel drive and the EQS AMG. Here, it's optional. So if this car didn't have the Hyperscreen we have seen throughout this episode, it would have the same dash as the S-Class, which is not a pretty thing. So I'd say this is an important option. It's the Hyperscreen. It's the secondary screen in front of the passenger. Now, you guys have heard me crank and moan in previous S-Class and EQS episodes about this very system. What it needs is aluminum knobs that have some heft to it, toggle switches that add to the luxury feel of what this is trying to do. The design is wonderful, but this just needs a little bit, actually a lot more, to get over the finish line and justify, you ready for this? $7,230 just for that option. And that brings us to the only other item we pay extra for, which would be the destination and handling. Von Sindelfingen, Deutschland for $1,050, which brings us to a total retail price of $116,305. Now notice at the top of the episode, I did not compare the base price of this with the base price of a 580, because I wanted you to understand that at $116,000 for the way this car is equipped, one can have the all-wheel drive 516 horsepower 580 that has the Hyperscreen for free for $119,110. Let's you and I be frank with one another. This is a discussion not about going around corners or how sporty this thing is. This is more about the ride quality. And immediately when you get behind the wheel, you do notice a bit of a difference in the ride quality, specifically when you get into comfort or eco mode. There's more waft to this than in a 580, and obviously way more than in an EQS AMG. You notice it more towards the front of the vehicle, a little bit of a pitch from side to side that's more pronounced. Speaking of the steering, there it's a good weighting, there's good feedback, a bit better than in other EVs in the luxury car realm. Back to the ride quality, and there the biggest difference you notice is really the lack of immediacy that's not coming from the front of the vehicle like in the 580. And here it's overall, again, it's kind of the theme with this thing, like the acceleration. This reinforces the luxury car first, EV second, and that's absolutely apparent in all of the driving dynamics of the vehicle. Now, as a recap as to what's underneath the vehicle, it's airmatic both in the front and the rear of the car. It does have the active four-wheel steering, in this case, up to 10 degrees, so it's absolutely a rock star in parking lot situations. I talked more about that in the EQS 580 episode and gave you a demonstration. Then there are the brakes. It's 15.35-inch diameter rotors in the front and 14.88 in the back. That's unusually large for an electric vehicle, especially one of this size. However, there's one downside to those very large brakes. You would expect them to work incredibly well. Like, for example, let's try a panic stop here. And there just isn't enough immediacy. There isn't enough braking power for the power. Even though it's only 329 horsepower, as we discussed earlier, you would expect more braking power. And I think the real issue here is how much brake is really working against how much mass. This thing is the better part of 5,600 pounds. So if I'm reading the tea leaves correctly, the lack of braking, or really I should say the lack of immediacy in the braking, is not a function of the size of the brakes. Because let's be honest, almost 15.5 inches of front rotors, that's a huge brake. But in this case, this is electric, which means you've got some regen going on, which means there's some tuning that's done to the braking. So on one end of the spectrum, remember the early Prius, that was like an on-off switch in terms of the braking. But then you look at a Taycan today, a Taycan Turbo S with carbon ceramic rotors, that braking system behaves and performs like the braking system in an ICE Porsche. So what the Mercedes engineers can do here is go back and re-engineer the way the braking is delivered in the 450 Plus, because this was not an issue in the 580 and the EQS AMG. Okay, so short answer to the question we posed at the top of the episode, yeah, you kind of need all-wheel drive in this use case, and not for the reasons that people would think. Most would say, oh my God, need all-wheel drive for inclement weather. Yeah, there's that, but this, it's more about the overall package, the driving dynamics, and some of the changes in the vehicle. We learned this with a couple of options is dangerously close to the price of a car that has 516 horsepower, a second motor, all-wheel drive, and frankly has that Hyperscreen fitted as standard. I'd say it's a combination of, yeah, I might want the all-wheel drive, and frankly a better equipped, more rounded vehicle, which brings us to the wish list. And there's a lot of things we discussed throughout this episode. Let's put them on one master list, and that would be the brakes, the stuff we have just complained about with this screen in many episodes, including the S-Class, please, knobs, toggle switches that add to the luxury feel of this, a wonderful luxury car. And then last but not least, and not just for this vehicle, but for all the coming Mercedes-Benz full electric vehicles that will be based upon it, 800-volt architecture. I mean, seriously, what the hell were you thinking not doing that? You knew Porsche was doing it. You had to do it here with this price of a vehicle. It is inexcusable. Anyway, this is one man's opinion, and this is where I turn this around to you guys to opine in the comments below or via our social media, Motoman TV, all one word, Motoman TV, all one word, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And a little bit behind the scenes of this episode. So this car turned up on a Wednesday, and I was supposed to hand back that M3 all-wheel drive with the carbon fiber race bucket seats in it on the same day. But BMW, they kind of changed their schedule last minute, and they wanted to send me that iX, like M50, which is coming in 2 days. So, hey, you know, keep the M3 for an extra 2 days. Now, which one do I drive home? Until I see you next time, bis später.